It's not like you got a blowout in your walk-in cooler. You walk in the next morning, and all of a sudden, your dough is all cached for the day. What are you going to do, close? No, absolutely not. We talk about emergency doughs and all these different formulas. That's 100% saying grabbing the reins, time and temperature. Are you going to make your standard dough formula into an emergency dough and use the same exact process that you do every day? No way. We're going back to grandma style. Lighter flour if you have to. If you have a 72-hour dough and all of a sudden you got nothing left for today, everything is completely gone, and you got to build up slowly an inventory over the next 2 days to get you back to normal, how are we going to do it? You a little bit lighter flour so that dough is ready today. Warmer water so the dough is ready today. Depending on what your mix is like, right? If you're at a 14% protein, I'm going to throw protein, because we talk about high gluten, high protein. What is that? It's usually we're somewhere around 14%, right? If you're at a 14% type flour, maybe use the same flour, but maybe you cut it. Put 20, 30% of a lighter flour in there. To me, I would rather say do your testing before you have that oh shit moment. Right? Because when it is time that now we need this dough to happen, it's like practicing a fire drill, right? You're ready for it. Is that a 13% flour that you switch to for that one day? And then the next day you make your dough that day for 2 days, 3 days, you start building it up. You're going to have to find what the balance is. Because if you go and start meddling with the flour mix, you'll also be changing things as far as structure-wise. I would rather say use a little bit lighter flour, make the dough, get it ready as fast as we can get it ready. Don't put those dough balls back into the walk-in cooler. Leave them out, because from the time that comes out of the mixer and you make your dough balls, you're going to need 4 hours easily until that dough is open enough, because you'll never be able to stretch it, right? When we make Neapolitan pizza, if we go back to Campo di Monte, where the mothership is in Naples, right? When we make dough balls, we're not looking to make the tightest dough ball that we can. Those dough balls are a little slack. And as a matter of fact, when we cut them, we call it a staglio. We cut that strip of dough, and then we roll it like mozzarella, and we pinch it off. We're gently rolling. That's kind of like a stretch and fold in itself. We pinch off the bottom, and we place that dough ball nice inside the container. So why give it all this extra resistance and all this extra tension, right? Make it a little bit, don't roll it as tight, and it'll open up for you sooner. So when you go and you press that dough. If you're using a machine and you're using a dough sheeter or a docker and all this other stuff, these are different things we're talking. We're talking about still handmade, artisan type products, right? And that's not saying you can't make an artisan product with a machine. But again, you can have the greatest dough in the world and then throw it at a machine and people see that, and all of a sudden you're like Chuck E. Cheese again. You know, like too much yeast will create too much acidity. It'll create other problems. All of a sudden you've got so much activity happening, our yeast is going to start dying when it hits probably about 120 degrees, right? So when you stretch that dough out and it goes into the oven, that extra yeast is really going to push into the structure of that dough, and all of a sudden you're going to see that your dough is going to puff up like a pita, right? So adding more yeast is not the solution. Everyone's like, oh, it's tight. Add some more yeast. That's the old school way. But it'll actually create other problems down the line. Keep the dough the same and play with the temperature, because harness what's already there for you and then open it up. I make a Neapolitan dough, right? My dough formula, as we writing right now. My Neapolitan dough that I make every single day, I use a full bag of Caputo Blue, 25 kilo bag of blue, 15 liters of water, 4 grams of fresh yeast. 4 grams of fresh yeast is literally the point of my pinky. And when people see that, it's never going to rise. Well, not that it's not going to rise. It's never going to go into the refrigerator. I'm temping my water old school with the water like I'm temping a baby bottle, right? Because I want my water to be somewhere about 85 degrees, 90 degrees. So we're not working with a cold dough. We're working in a manner like they did it 300 years ago before there was electricity in Naples, right? 4 grams of yeast is plenty of yeast to do what we have to do. And then what happens when that yeast dies? That intense high oven is going to rise 2 times. The pizza is going to rise twice. You'll see that the yeast will pop open, and then all of a sudden, if you watch right about 30 seconds, it'll rise one more time. Because when our yeast dies at that 120 degree mark, right, 140, whatever it is, all of a sudden, we've got one other principle. The second biggest ingredient in our dough is what? The water. What temperature does water boil? 212 degrees and turns to steam. This is what we call oven spring. So all of a sudden, that dough pops a little bit. It's almost like, trying to boost a guy over the wall, right? The guy standing here is the yeast. The guy puts his foot and he gives it a little push. But it's the guy's leg pushing down here that pushes him the rest of the way over the wall. It's the water that's puffing this thing up, creating the rest of that open structure, the lightness. We love to work with high hydration doughs. It's not an easy dough to work with, right, if you're not used to managing it with your fingers. But once you get that balance, you know how to work with it, the results are incredible. So frozen dough is another one. I would rather hear you tell me that I'm going to take my current dough formula that I make every day and figure out how to freeze it than to call your local distributor and send me a case of individually wrapped dough balls to stick in my cooler. My advice to you is this. You can use the exact same dough formula for making frozen dough, but for yeast, fresh yeast gives you the best results out of the freezer because fresh yeast is supported by a lot of water where dry yeast isn't, right? Dry yeast going into the freezer, you usually start to see it break down after maybe, 4 or 5 days. It'll start looking a little funky because that yeast is getting kind of freezer burned and dying. But if you use fresh yeast, when you make a frozen dough, typically we can keep dough balls for a month, individually wrapped. During the pandemic, everybody was selling pizza kits and dough ball kits, right? And everybody was asking that same question. I would just say, take your current formula. You got to recalculate the amount of yeast, right? Because dry yeast is a lot stronger than fresh yeast, so you don't need as much dry yeast. Converting back to fresh yeast, you're going to use a different amount, a little bit more, right? So I would say switch to fresh yeast, and you'll be able to freeze your dough just fine. Yeah, because you're going to have to slack that dough out anyway. Most guys that use a frozen dough will put it on sheet pans, put it on a bakery rack, and stick it in their walk-in cooler. Or if you need it right away, within 2-3 hours, it'll be slacked out, and then you'll be able to run it. I always did like to make a frozen dough with oil. My Neapolitan dough doesn't do as good in the freezer, right? But I think that, again, why do we like the oil in there? Because it's another layer of protection. The oil is kind of lubricating that structure that we've created inside and protecting that gluten, and ultimately it'll help you out in the long run.